Welcome, everyone. My name is Karen Mock, and I am very pleased to be a founding board member of the Pearson Center for Progressive Policy. I'm also president of J-Space Canada, a progressive Jewish organization. As many of you know, the Pearson Center is a progressive think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. In that context, I'm pleased to welcome you to our 28th webinar since April. Wow. I'm especially pleased to be co-moderating today with Andrew Cardozo, who is an adjunct professor at Carleton University and a columnist with the Hill Times. Most of you know Andrew as the founder and president of the Pearson Center. He's the heart and soul of the center, without whom none of this would be possible. Just a heads up, I'm calling in from Northern Ontario in the rain, so bear with me if my connection fades a bit from time to time. With regard to the format of our webinar, the discussion will last about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A. Please use the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can before we end at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our very special guest for today, the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy. But in some ways, he's not really a guest, because one of the things you may not know about Lloyd is that among his huge list of accomplishments and credentials that I'll get to in a minute, he too is a founding board member of the Pearson Center. And it has indeed been an honor to serve on the board with you, Lloyd. The Honorable Lord Axworthy has long been an influential and progressive policy thinker in Canada. Lloyd served in the Manitoba legislature and was federal member of parliament for 21 years. He was in the cabinets of Prime Ministers Pierre Trudeau, John Turner, and Jean Chrétien. Lloyd has been Minister of Employment, Minister of Immigration, Minister of Transport, and most notably, Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1996 to 2000. As Foreign Affairs Minister, he was very active in multilateral negotiations, working closely with other countries on many key issues, including the Ottawa Treaty on Landmines, for which he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Lloyd also spent 10 years as president of the University of Winnipeg, where he advanced it to be a major modern post-secondary institution and increased its focus on accessibility for Indigenous students. Lloyd continues to work on world issues as chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council, working with counterparts around the world on this major challenge of the 21st century. Welcome, Lloyd. But before we get to the meat of our discussion, and your insights on what the world is coming to now, we'd love to hear some reflections on your amazing political career. You started off working for John Turner as a special assistant when he was in Trudeau's cabinet in the 60s. And we so appreciated your eloquent commentary on the CBC yesterday at John Turner's state funeral. What drew you in the first place to work in a political office? And why with John Turner for a start?
Well, do we have an extra hour, Karen? It's going to take us back a while, but again, let me thank you for the kind introduction, and Andrew for being the spark plug behind these webinars. You're right, it's an opportunity to talk about progressive ideas and policies, and so I welcome the chance to be with you. And I guess if I had to first highlight a moment was when I was in grade 12 at Sisler High School in the north end of Winnipeg. And our history teacher, A.J. Phillips, required all of us to go downtown to the old sort of convention center for Winnipeg to hear a politician. Many of us were kind of suggesting that wasn't exactly the way to spend our time, but he indicated that 25% of our semester marks were going to be on the table, so we got with it. Well, that politician turned out to be not your Hollywood typecast, but somewhat roly-poly guy with a polka dot bow tie. Of course, I'm talking about Mike Pearson. And I will never forget the experience of listening. This was just after he had won the Nobel Prize for his work on peacekeeping. He talked about how Canada has a special place because of all our history and the values we brought in and our geography. We are able to do things that many other countries, many other groups of people can't do. Not by flexing our muscles. We're never known for being on the sort of might makes right side of the ledger. But what we did talk about is how we can help convene, we can help moderate, we can help initiate, we can help think. And I've always felt that that's a very precious gift that we've been given as Canadians. And to go back to the ceremony yesterday for John Turner, he was very much in that vein of thought. He was one of the liberal reformers of the 60s. And I just come back from graduate school and was starting my first year of teaching at what is now the University of Winnipeg. And I got a call to come and join him. He was then the Minister of Consumer Corporate Affairs. A lot of people don't talk about that. They talk about his achievements as a justice minister, as a prime minister, finance minister. But here's something I hope Canadians will tuck away. That at the time he was opening up a legislative initiative to change the Patent Act to allow generic drug manufacturers to start offering drugs at a much lower price, be in competition with the traditional pharma companies. Not an easy thing to do, especially because he was a member of Parliament from Montreal. But I remember coming into his office, and he gave me an assignment. He said, "Look, we want you to go out and talk to people in the party." Gosh, the party, because the party at the time was a little bit of a crucible for people making policy. I want you to talk to people in the street. I want you to talk to doctors and nurses. And so that was my job. And when we came back to have discussions with officials and internally, he kept saying, "Now, what are you hearing?" And I was able to tell him very clearly that for Canadians, the idea of lowering the cost of drugs would be a huge benefit in many ways. And to his great credit, he overcame a lot of pressure. He brought the legislation in, and as I said yesterday in the broadcast, just think of the billions of dollars that has been saved, not for just our healthcare system, but for all kinds of ordinary Canadians. It was part of the basic foundation of our healthcare system. And that was an early start where I just realized that this was a man who really believed that reform was possible. And you sometimes had to take some hard knocks to get there. And so he became a mentor, and I learned a great deal from him. And as a result, followed my own political career.
Wow, what a legacy he left.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Karen,
Lloyd,
can I add one additional point?
sure.
One of those lessons, because that we were talking about earlier, is that he was a parliamentarian. He believed that the kind of foundation for our democracy is the ability of people to elect a representative to represent them. And that meant that Parliament was really should be the catalytic agent for discussion, for oversight, for initiative. I think that that's something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. There's a message from John Turner. Our democracy is really dependent on how good our parliamentary system is, and we have to start paying a lot more attention to it.
For sure. Well, Lloyd, you yourself were in 3 cabinets.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like being in the Trudeau, Turner, and Chrétien cabinets? Do you have any, shall we say, behind the doors, closed doors things that you can share with us on what it was like to work so closely with so many different prime ministers?
Karen, I think that's the key word, is different prime ministers. Very different people, very different ways of organizing, and but in all cases, I can say that it was a privilege to serve with the 3 gentlemen that you mentioned, and they really, really strongly believed that government was a constructive agency. You know, we've been through some bad times. I mean, the Reagan, Thatcher years of government, it needs to be constricted, handcuffed. These were people who said government needs to be a positive force for ensuring that the common good is met. It's the only institution that has that responsibility. And in the case of Mr. Trudeau, I think one of the most fascinating intellectual powerhouses I think I've ever met. But my biggest and strongest memory is being part of the discussion around the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And that was started, as you know, as a small amendment to restore the amendment power. And I remember having a long caucus meeting where it was debated. The opposition and a lot of commentators were saying, you know, don't get into these fancy businesses of having bills of rights and stuff. And I remember Mr. Trudeau listening for, I think it was a 6-hour long meeting. And finally at the end, kind of nodding and saying, well, we have a choice between the Volkswagen and the Cadillac, and we're going for the Cadillac. And we're going to go for a full-scale Charter of Rights. And I got to tell you, what a moment that was, and what again, a contribution. The other thing I would add is that one thing that Mr. Trudeau is not given credit for is his efforts in his last year of office in '84 to restart negotiations on nuclear proliferation, nuclear management. And again, I think that was part of the tradition that goes back to Pearson, is that Canada has a moral case for being the first country to ever turn down the opportunity to be a nuclear power. We had all the elements, we had all the skills, but we said no in 1945. And Mr. Trudeau, much again to the kind of critique of many, went around to the portals of different powers, to Mr. Reagan, Miss Thatcher, to the Germans, and saying, look, we have to come to grips with this. And it's not, I think, totally, I think it's not a coincidence. And Mrs. Thatcher met in Iceland to talk about a new deal for nuclear weapons. So that was a great, I mean, what person could be more privileged to be part of that kind of major political progressive debates? In Mr. Turner's case, I want to say that maybe his achievement, short as it was as prime minister, was a stage he set to become a very sort of creative leader of the opposition. And here's another story, if I might, if I'm not taking too much time. But in the run-up to the 1988 election, where Mr. Mulroney and the Conservatives were promoting the Canadian U.S. free trade deal, I remember getting a call from him just after New Year's to come and meet with him in Toronto, one of the airport hotels. And he had been around Toronto, he'd been talking to people, and he came and he said, I'm concerned that Canadians aren't really focused on fact, what does this mean for our ability to be an independent voice, an independent player. And we have to make sure that we're not against free trade as it is, but we're against the deal that puts too many handcuffs on it. And I think it was, again, that debate in '88. Remember this is a really hit. Everybody always had said, foreign policy, international affairs, no interest in elections. People don't pay attention. That election was fought, and one of the most crucial decisions that this country made. People responded to it. And again, it was something that I thought set the tone. And then, of course, with Mr. Chrétien, who was one of the great all-time political what I call intuitive politicians. He he could he could sense an idea, an issue, something happening ahead of all. He had the strongest radar I think I've ever seen. But again, remember, he came in and he with Paul Martin had to deal with a huge burgeoning deficit. But in the meantime, we also had to try and maintain a good social network and a commitment. And so I was his human resource minister, where I had to, but with his authorization, started a major review of social policy, which I think led to things like changing to the employment insurance idea, coming to grips with a different package of support. And then finally, I mean, when I was given the real privilege of being foreign minister, we were able to bring what we called in our human security agenda, that the base of our foreign policy would be based on protecting individuals and citizens, not just nation states or governments. And that led to, as you said, to the Landmine Treaty, to our work on the International Court, on child soldiers, on small weapons. We use the human security really as a major platform in which to present a different notion of how we could act and behave internationally. I mean, I'm sorry for taking your time. That's about the 25-cent tour I just gave you. But to me, what a string of, I mean, as I look back on my career, what a string of wonderful opportunities I had to serve in the cabinets of real liberal-minded reformers.
Well, I must say, I could listen to you tell these stories and the importance of these legacies all day. But as Peter Biro's new book tells us, worldwide, constitutional democracy is under stress, and there's a need for heroic citizenship. So to discuss those world affairs, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Karen Mock, and I think you set the stage for what we're going to talk about next. And Lord, thank you for starting off talking about your interest with Lester Pearson. Of course, that's important to us at the Pearson Center. And let me come back to that point and talk about multilateralism. Today, we've got a number of people who are listening to us, some of whom are experts in global affairs, others who are new to the field and just want to hear about what you, Lloyd Axworthy, has to say. Can I ask you to talk about multilateralism, about what it meant back in the Pearson times, the Pearsonian idea that we talk about, and where multilateralism is today?
Well, I think going back to the original sort of definition that came out of, in the Second World War, when so many of the governments of the world recognized that in order to prevent another Holocaust like we had found and the kind of murderous war experience the world had been through, we had to find a way to collaborate. The League of Nations had failed before the war. And as a result, and you have to give the Americans a lot of that credit, because they were the architects of things like the IMF and the World Trade Organization and even the United Nations itself. And the principle is that it would be a gathering place for the governments of nation states to come together. That's what it says multilateral, and certainly that's the context we're still working in part. But Andrew, we've changed a lot since then. I mean, I think that what I've seen happening is that increasingly there is a growing demand and need for a much stronger sense of participation of people directly. Multilateral as a government-based organization, but let me use the UN as an example. As you pointed out, I'm working on refugee issues. When they had the major convocations a couple of years ago to find a reform, a lot of the issues were not even on the table because the consensus was based on the lowest common denominator. There's a lot of things you just couldn't talk about. And so things like, how do you fund a refugee system by a series of donations? It's like raising money for the spring prom. There was no kind of assessment. There was no accountability under the Refugee Convention for countries to live up to their pledges or their commitments. And as a result, I think there's been a growing sense that multilateralism now means not just the interaction or collaboration of governments, but increasingly the collaboration of civil societies, of businesses, of universities, of labor. I mean, there's a whole new set of networks and coalitions and arrangements coming together. And that, in a sense, is the new face of multilateralism. Maybe we have to find a better term for it. But I think that that is the thing that, as we proceed into this COVID era, to learn how decision making is going to have to be a lot more agile. Connectivity is going to have to be a major component of diplomacy. The ability to convene and work and then move on, and particularly to find ways of enabling people who don't have voices to participate. I'm thinking particularly of refugees and displaced persons, of which there's over 80 million in the world today, who are trying to come to grips with the impact of COVID and climate change, but because they don't have governments representing them, they're really at the end of the queue, and therefore their interests are not going to be developed or promoted. And that's where I think a lot of the new creative thinking has to take place.
Okay, in going back 50, 60 years ago, was there an acceptance that we may not like everybody, but that we have to work with, but we still work with them? Whereas today, there's sort of an increasing number of countries who say they don't want to work with that country or this country, and we sort of are pulling apart a lot more.
Andrew, I think you put your finger on one of the really dilemmas, a dilemma we're facing in our own country. I mean, you've now got a kind of reemergence of a great power strife and competition. The United States, China, Russia kibitzing from the sidelines by taking over places like Crimea. The old Cold War idea was containment. And I always thought that that was a proper stance as long as you included engagement as part of that containment. There were areas that you had to be, I think, multitasking. And I think we have to be careful that we don't fall into, again, a kind of rigid them versus us kind of outlook or mentality.
Right.
And there's a lot, by the way, a lot of forces promoting those discussions. We know how the cyber interference in our media and our social media and even in our political discourse is not something that is founded in an open, transparent way, but is all designed to set up these kind of divisions and fractions and fragmentations.
Yeah. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag here going on, so if I'm sounding a bit distant, because I'm just waiting to see if you have finished or whether the screen is just frozen. You mentioned COVID. The WHO has come under a lot of criticism, both from its opponents, but also its supporters. What's your assessment of the WHO and the UN and other UN agencies that could and should be involved, such as UNICEF?
Well, let's talk about the WHO for a moment. I mean, you said there's all kinds of critiques, complaints, grievances. What is not being talked about is how the budget of the WHO over the last decade has been eviscerated. The amount of money that would enable it to take on direct missions, to provide an early warning system, to be able to provide support for responses to countries that are beginning to face early signs, the Ebola crisis and the SARS crisis. All those things have been really kind of sharp. And as a result, the WHO has really been reduced to almost kind of what I guess I would call a round table, without really having the authority or the responsibility to even hold governments accountable. And as governments in the United Nations have cut back their contributions, it means that it has simply made the WHO more vulnerable to more direct pressures from one government or another. And I think that's happening throughout the system. I mean, the multilateral system we talk about, the international agencies, the UN programs, they're all being underfunded. I mean, you saw the Secretary General 5 or 6 months ago said we have to set up a new fund to deal with COVID, only about 30–40% of it's been pledged. And we're still working on this archaic notion that this is somehow a kind of pledging exercise, as opposed to something that has huge impact on our security and our stability. But we're increasingly now playing this game that every country is an island unto itself. You build higher walls, you pull up the bridges, and you say everything is self-contained. And in fact, quite the opposite's happening. The more the kind of global risks take place, the more it's going to put a lot of pressure on individual domestic economies, politics, social well-being.
Yes, and just in terms of the COVID vaccine, each country is trying to prepare to buy up as much as vaccine as they can, right, when it becomes a reality for themselves, and not allow it. I mean, everybody's buying up more than they could possibly need, and not allowing enough for certainly developing countries, right, and those that can't pay the high price.
Andrew, one of the deep concerns that we heard through our Refugee Migration Council, and we spoke to women who are involved in refugee concentrations, is the fact that they will be cut out. There's, I guess, what you're calling vaccine nationalism is taking place. Right. I think there's a group of countries, including our own country of Canada, which is making a real effort to get. There's a new coalition called COVAX, which is committed to making sure of equal distribution, and I think our own government just put in about $220 million, which I think was a really important gesture. But that's a very small portion of what's going to be needed. Because if the big guys, the guys who like to throw the muscle around, are saying it's we're the first in line, and whatever's left on the table, we might decide who gets it. That's not the way it's going to work. And then, to me, that's really one of the incredibly tough issues that we're going to be facing in the next year or two, if not sooner.
And sorry, just if you can just explain COVAX a little more. Is it an entity, a group of people coming together on their own, or are they connected to WHO? Or
they're connected. It's working through WHO. It's governments. A number of companies, corporations, businesses have said they will contribute to that. A lot of the pharma companies have said they'll play ball on an equitable distribution, but that's by no means universal. And certainly we got a lot of outliers, including our neighbor to the south under Mr. Trump, who says they'll have nothing to do with it. So this is going to be, I think, one of those Armageddon moments that we sometimes face internationally. And if we don't do it, give me a moment, Andrew, to say, I think what we are facing is this kind of interlacing, overlapping confluence of COVID, climate, conflict, corruption. As a result, a lot of people are really being hurt. And we're already talking about tens of millions of new migrants over the next 10 years because they can no longer the circumstances they're in. And we have to start learning how to make a policy that incorporates and integrates those different risk factors, those existential risks that we're facing in a coherent way. And that's not happening, frankly. COVAX is one example of an attempt to do that, but its membership is still too small. And I think as Canadians, I think we should be actively applauding what our own government's doing and urge them to kind of become an active agency for doing it. That goes back to the point I said earlier about the Pearson legacy. We can be a convener and we can be an initiator. And I think this is one of the key issues that we have to face.
Yeah, and it is. And sometimes I get the feeling that when you look at the world scene in global affairs, the issue of COVID in some people's minds is still a secondary issue or sort of out there, a health issue, but it is really the central issue of our time and will continue to be for a few years.
Yeah, and but we're all, I think the scientists and experts are now beginning to see how there's an overlap, that the way in which we have damaged the environment, opening up far too actively urban areas that encroach upon wilderness and landscape, is giving a license for new pathogens to emerge. There's work being done, for example, in the old northern Arctic regions, that toxics that have been buried for thousands of years, as the permafrost melts, are going to start surfacing and bringing a whole new set of threats into the food chain. So animals will be affected, fish will be affected, and eventually we'll be affected. So somehow we have to get our heads around the idea of how do you provide a policy framework or a set of arrangements, a network, if you like, that's able to understand and cope with that kind of holistic picture. And there's a big, to use the examples of a couple of American authors I just read, there's a big shift going on. And as a result, a lot of the conventional practices that we have aren't applicable anymore.
Yeah. Lloyd, you've made some references to the World Refugee Migration Council. Can you tell us a little more about the issues you're focusing on there?
Andrew, I'm not picking up your sound.
Okay, sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, I wanted to ask you about the World Refugee Migration Council, about your priorities there.
Well, as you know, it came together almost 3 years ago to start working on how do we provide practical, concrete solutions? How do we assist the kind of broad-based agreements that the United Nations High Commission on Refugees and others were putting together, but couldn't get the kind of ammunition that worked. Here's a couple of the key issues. The first one, that increasingly is important, is the one I mentioned earlier, of trying to provide the right platform by which refugee and displaced persons have an access to having their voice heard, as opposed to simply being sort of carried to or stewarded by other people. That's a fundamental right that they have to influence decisions that affect them. And that's, I think, where the new digital technology, part of which we're using right now, opens up a whole new set of opportunities or capabilities of doing that. The second one is a fundamental issue that we discovered when we were out doing our consultations in refugee areas, and that is that the funding is so sort of under distributed, underpledged, that a lot of the basic programs to enable refugees to establish a form of their own settlement, to do their own economic development, to look after themselves, to get educated. I mean, 60% of kids in refugee camps have trouble getting education. That's, again, that's going to be a sort of a cesspool of people who are no longer able to feel that they are being listened to. And that's where you begin getting extremism. That's where you get political divisions taking place. And so we put a proposal forward in front of our own government and the German government and others to find a way of taking the assets that have been purloined, who were designed to support refugee displacement work, but are now in somebody's piggy bank, by the kleptocrats and the autocrats and the oligarchs. There's billions of dollars around the world that are being laundered, are being hidden, are being put into treasuries in somebody's basement, that they have to be judicially brought to the forefront, and the distribution of those assets go out to the people who have been deeply victimized by the actions. So we've been working hard to kind of get a change in our own judicial system. That we have the Magnitsky Act in Canada, as we know, which provides a sanctioning against human rights abuses. What we need now is a way of taking those funds that have been frozen and redistributing to those who have been the have lost out because that money has been switched away into somebody's bank account. That's a third thing, which I think is really increasingly important, is the need to really look at the question of accountability. We're seeing a whole set of actions, but let's just look at what the European Union did last week, a new refugee policy, which can lead to actually people being refouled back into their own circumstances that they had to flee from. So a lot of the basic rules that we've had to protect the rights of refugee and displaced persons are no longer being honored, are no longer being given the support that they need. And because there's no accountability mechanism. That's another place in terms of how the multilateral system has to change, is some way in which the accountability of governments, of warlords, of oligarchs can be held up to light and can be clearly sort of open for proper accountability and shaming and naming them. And I think that's one of the most important things. Again, a place where I think our own country could lead.
Yeah, and do you think the refugee situation worldwide is going to get worse over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think it's going to get worse because the conditions that create people having to move are becoming, as I pointed out before, almost more compounded. Epidemics, climate changes, ongoing conflicts, bad government, and a shortage of funds. As a result, the head of the United Nations High Commission, Filippo Grandi, said, we're looking at maybe another 10, 15, 20 million people being forced to move in the next decade or so. And part of the problem, as we know, is that we don't have a definition for people who've been affected by climate. The old Refugee Convention is all based on political persecution. That's a concept that came out of the Second World War. And there's been an inability to redefine that and to get a broader definition and to provide clear rules, responsible rules. And that's, again, something through our Refugee Council, we're trying to promote not just governments, but also people in the academy, lawyers, philosophers, political scientists, to come up with how do we begin to handling the fact that all kinds of new people are going to become part of a great migration flow. Right. And migration, by the way, is a good thing. It's been able to help the world grow over the millenniums. But if people are having to move with no support, with no rules, with no protection, then it becomes a huge source of major instability and threats to global security.
Yeah, can I move to a different topic under this theme of what is the world coming to, and talk about polarization globally? I mean, you think of the trend of strongman populist leaders like Trump and Putin, Xi, Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, Modi, Erdogan, Duterte, Urban, the list goes on. So that's sort of happening on one scene. And then you're just seeing politics in various countries becoming more polarized. Where are we headed? Why is this happening? Well, let me ask you first, why is this happening?
Well, I think because a lot of people have become disgruntled with the lack of effort and the lack of good governance, that they've lost faith, they've lost trust in the staff, because they've become, as the COVID epidemic has laid bare, the inequalities, the inequities, socially, geographically, economically, are becoming really pretty wide chasms. And I think a lot of people just are vulnerable. And you put into that mix the impact of a social media that can coalesce a lot of those grievances. And you put the third thing, a group of posse, a kind of a vigilante group of the names of people you just mentioned and more, who think that they can gain political power and hold it by creating fear and creating division. Then you really have almost a septic tank of casualties going on. And my only way is to make sure that we provide a counterpoint to that. And then we have to start thinking about how do we reform our institutions, but also create some new ones to give the voice to people. And the very tool of social media that has become a kind of currency for a lot of these extremist organizations can also become the same medium for a lot of progressive, constructive coalitions and agreements and networks to provide the offset to that. So I think we have, I keep going back, I guess, to message that was discussed yesterday in John Turner's memorial. It really means that democracy has to get its act together. And by getting its act together, it means making sure that we're much more effective and capable of opening up the channels of decision to people right now who are denied that basic right.
Let me jump ahead to one of the questions that has come in from the audience in relation to this point. The question is your thoughts on the ever-increasing centralization of the power of the PMO, the Prime Minister's Office in Canada. And I think some people relate the centralization having begun when you were in your first cabinet position in Pierre Trudeau's cabinet.
Well, I mean, I think what you described is not just happening here, it's happening everywhere. I mean, I just read an article in The Guardian this morning about how Boris Johnson's using the cover of COVID to centralize power again and to put Parliament into a furlough situation. And that's, I come back to the point. I think one of the key issues that we have to deal with is how do we lance the boil of mistrust that is out there. And that means that we have to make sure that first, our electoral system is much fairer and more equitable. It means we have to deal with a regional system. Donald Savoy has commented many times, we're one of the few federal systems that doesn't have and the provinces do that. But if you get, now I, for a long time, was a regional minister, which meant that we were kind of a little bit of a focal point in our own provinces for trying to handle and deal with federal matters and negotiations with provinces and municipalities. But that's been discarded. And I think, so there really isn't much of a platform right now for those regional issues to be heard. And I think thirdly, there is just clearly, what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, increasing systemic racism being exposed in this country. Look, we had a report well over a year ago from the Commission on Missing and Murdered Women. Really good recommendations about how to deal with policing and how to provide protection of rights. We're still waiting for a legislative program. And by the way, I'm going to share with you, one of my pet projects, which will probably never happen in what's left of my lifetime. But I think that one of the flaws in our charter is that it only requires that Parliament meet once a year. My pet project will say, let's revise that charter to say that Parliament should be required to meet 20 days out of every quarter. And that means that no government can kind of short circuit Parliament. It's got to be there. And at the same time, I think we have to modernize Parliament to be much more connected. Than it probably is. And by the way, Andrew, I know that you've dealt with this. The agencies, it's not that you're there for a kind of a comfortable seat. You have responsibility as a member of Parliament, as a senator, to change the institution to which you were elected or appointed. And it's about time that our parliamentarians realize that they have the power to begin looking at election reform, parliamentary oversight, committee activity, and the right for Parliament to meet on a regular basis and not to be short-circuited, as too often happens.
Are you concerned about Parliament's role and Parliament sitting during the COVID period?
Well, I mean, I think, look at you and I, and Karen and the guests you have invited, we're all talking together. I don't think we've explored or been creative enough about how do we take the fundamental institution of Parliament and the people who are the members of it and enable them to be much more active and engaged, not only with each other, but with their constituents, with other parliamentarians. I think one of the missing links that we have right now is that parliamentarians aren't talking to each other across the borders, not looking at how we do things in common, and therefore getting their governments to be more responsive to cooperative or collaborative organizations or procedures. So I mean, I don't want to sound, that this is a one-note Charlie, but I think the role of Parliament, especially at a time when we see how quickly democracies can be shredded, that we have to really spend some time. And to me, those who should take responsibility are the parliamentarians themselves.
If you look at the situation in the United States, where there's tremendous polarization, you've got armed guys taking over state legislatures and stuff like that, the rise of the far right, are we? There's a feeling in Canada that that's all terrible and dastardly, but it'll never come to that in Canada. What's your feeling?
I think what would scare the hell out of me would be if Trump got reelected. I think we would then have 4 years of total and completely recklessness, and that means that as their neighbor on their northern border, he would have no compunction or restraint in letting loose the kind of forces that he's encouraged and fostered in his own country. I mean, I think what's happening in the United States is a lesson for us all. That what we thought, and Americans thought, was a very kind of good set of checks and balances on corrupt use of power, has shown to be so much vulnerable to the kind of machinations of Mr. Trump and his enablers. In this case, in particular, the Republican Party. They've been able to totally ignore the rights of the Congress. Talking about fascism. And she said, you have to remember that Mussolini and Hitler and others all came to power through democratic means. They got themselves elected, and then they used the power of the state to consolidate and expand that power. And so I think that that's why I keep coming back for the need of our own examination about where we have to make sure that we have a capacity to guard against this. But the other side of it is the social and economic side. I think we really have to, both domestically and globally, work to be overcoming the gaps and the inequities and the fact that so many people are left behind. And we have to do that in a totally and complete integrated way. And I think that, again, provides the kind of demonstration that governments can trust, or people can trust their governments because they are being willing to respond to people's very needs. Charles Taylor, our famous Canadian philosopher, said, we need an affirmation of ordinary life, and to make sure that everybody has a sense, not that they can become a celebrity or billionaire, but that they can get up in the morning without feeling they're going to be arrested. They can look at the sunset, their kids can go to school, they have enough food to eat. And that means that we've got to be much more active in overcoming these kind of serious gaps and fissures that we have in our society. And that's what we should be doing now. I mean, this is a period where maybe COVID has exposed what the problems are globally and locally. And I think we have to start putting our mind, how do we take the lessons and begin to apply them?
Yeah. I just want to say to the audience, we're doing what we can about some technical difficulties that we're having, but we'll keep plowing on. Laurie, there are a number of questions coming in from the audience. Let me start with some of them. The first one on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Canada has declined to sign on. There is some sense that there's a view that the treaty would in some way undermine NATO. What is your view on what the government should be doing and why? I note that you were a signatory with a number of other prominent folks, right. Former ministers of foreign affairs and prime ministers who have called on the Canadian government to sign on. So could you give us a sumline sketch of your argument about why the government should sign on?
Well, let me begin with what I said earlier. Canada was the very first country to deliberately decide not to become a nuclear nation. We had the science, we had the technology, we had the uranium, we had the know-how. But there's a wonderful statement in McGeorge Bundy's memoir about these kind of Canadians are interesting people. They had all the capacity to become a nuclear state and decided not to. That gives me, I think, a moral base on which, for most of our following history, we followed through. I use the example of Mr. Trudeau. I think that talking about the NATO in 1996, if I'm not mistaken, there was a NATO summit in Washington. The Canadian government, we led the charge to eliminate the number one goal of the NATO alliance, which is to use nuclear weapons as a first strike force. We said that makes no sense. That only exacerbates the threat and risk. Needless to say, we didn't get much support for it, but we were there. We along with the Germans were saying it's time to change the whole nuclear sort of definition that NATO has. So to use that as a rationale for not participating, not even being in the discussions, and not joining the band, to me is something I think needs to be corrected. And I hope again that this period of open review and reset and reflection will mean that, because to go back to that kind of what I call that sort of perfect storm of COVID and climate and conflict, you have to add to that the nuclear risk. You now have Americans, Chinese, Russians renewing their arsenals, developing new weaponry. They've got the nuclear wannabes, the North Koreans and the Iranians and others wanting to get into the game. We're in danger of hitting that precipice. And I think Canada's a voice that must be heard. And I dearly hope that it will, maybe through your good offices and the work that you're doing through the Pearson Center, that could become a real issue that we can debate with the government.
Yeah, why do you think it hasn't caught public imagination? I mean, do you think the public thinks this is an issue that we've dealt with back in the 60s or 70s and it's over now? Or
yeah, I think we've been lulled into a certain kind of complacency about it. And I think it's also because there hasn't been an effort to generate interest. Again, if I can use an example from our own history, Bill Graham, who was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament when I was foreign minister, led a major parliamentary committee to go across the country and talk about Canada's nuclear weapons stance. And it was out of that came the whole proposal to do something about the NATO obligation. Again, as an example, here's Parliament that can be put to very constructive uses to begin to look at it and get Canadians re-engaged in what I think is, in a way, it's the oldest and longest existential risk that we as a humanity face.
Thank you, Lloyd. The next question is regarding Canada-China relations. We've got obviously the situation of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig being imprisoned in China, and Madam Meng being detained in Canada. And I just want to relate to you one of the issues that came up here. We had a webinar with the Chinese ambassador, Ambassador Chung, a couple of months ago. And one of the points he seemed to be suggesting was that on the overall issues that China is putting forward, they feel that the majority of countries in the world are on their side, especially around human rights, and that it's only a few Western countries who keep opposing them. Do you think this matter is even on the radar in China? Do they care much about it?
I don't think the public does. I think certainly it's being seen inside the government as an issue. I mean, I've been party to a couple of two-track discussions and things of that kind. And I think China realizes that it's got some real ongoing issues with, as it relates to Canada, the environmental issue, the climate issue. I mean, President Xi was at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago talking about how China wants to make major commitments for renewable energy. That's a positive line that we should be going at. At the same time, I think the Xi government is really abusing a lot of human rights around the world. Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, minority groups, Tibetans, and I think we're kind of losing our voice. We used to be able to provide a fairly strong condemnation of that, but at the same time we're prepared to undertake Team Canada and trade things of that sort. So it goes back to a balance between engagement and containment. And I think until we get ourselves out from under the almost straitjacket we're in around the case of Madame Meng, then Canada's not going to be able to. It has to unshackle itself to get back in the game of how to deal with China with agility and some creative activities, as opposed to simply being kind of put in a box, a moral box in many ways.
So should we, there's certainly been a suggestion that we should have an exchange of these individuals. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that was certainly the base of a letter that I signed along with many other people who worked with China over the years that was not accepted. It may be beyond that now because of the extradition hearings are now very much into the judicial format, although, as we know, the Attorney General of Canada, Justice Minister, can step in any time they want. I think, though, that what we need is a different kind of diplomacy. I think we need to be engaging with the Chinese about how do we provide some collateral exchanges. I mean, I think we should be asking the Chinese to really come to grips with the consular issues of the two diplomats who have been imprisoned. But make sure that they get all the rights pertaining to them. And say, and if there's some give on that side, let's look at what we give on our side. I mean, that's what negotiation and diplomacy is about. But right now, I think both sides are wedded into a kind of entrenchment, and I think that doesn't do us any good. And I think it also impinges our own ability to have a more creative and engaged policy that I think is really necessary at this time. China is not going away. And by the way, I mean, clearly, I've seen the new leader of the Conservative Party out there kind of trying to get back into the Cold War mode of that China is all the bad guy. They're not a government that Canadians agree with, and we shouldn't, because their actions now are becoming very aggressive. I still think we need to provide a way of not simply locking ourselves into a one-note system.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've been there. You've been in the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and you're dealing with these highly complex issues. Are you saying what we could be doing is trying to get sort of a little bit of movement, sort of step by step on either side, and maybe something can happen? Because the two countries don't want to back down, but are there little things that we can do in the meantime?
Andrew, I mean, it's a diplomacy is a process of small steps, sideways, front, sometimes back. But I think the whole point is to keep moving. And I think that to me should be the goal. Keep our diplomacy active enough. But I think we have to be more enabling of our diplomacy to make that happen, and not be treating it sort of as this sort of kind of great law and order issue. Look, Andrew, I'm going to be really blunt, and I guess I can do it because I'm an old guy and doesn't matter much. But when I was in office, and I know as a government, there was all kinds of negotiation and deal making that had to take place to protect Canadian citizens. The first item on my mandate letter from Prime Minister Crescent was, your job is to protect Canadians abroad. So I took that seriously, but that meant that you didn't kind of lock yourself into a position. You found some ways to fulfill that mandate. And I think that, I hope, as things, but at the same time, I think people like you and others should be carrying a message to the Chinese. It's about time they showed a little more diplomatic agility and commitment, and in order to kind of break through this logjam.
Okay, we are out of time, but I have to ask you two other questions before Karen Mock closes the session. And I'll just pose these to you, and I'll ask you for short answers, but they're two very, very doomsday questions, but I think we need to ask them in the context of what is the world coming to. So the first is, what future, if any, do you think there is for the International Criminal Court? And the second is, has the rules-based international order been obliterated?
Well, I think the answer is the same to both. I think the ICC is under attack. Americans, Chinese, Russians, big powers who don't like it, plus a lot of the kind of new autocrats that have emerged, and that's where I think we've got to be part of the battalions that support it. You know, I think that, for example, the attack that Secretary of State Pompeo has made on some of the officers of the ICC, including some Canadians who are prosecutors, and threatening them with sanctions, we should have been responding to that. We look at, stand up to these guys. I mean, Pompeo is driven by a whole different set of points of view than we are. Stand up to them. And at the same time, I think we have to. One of the things I think to add to the complex of international institutions, we need to be looking seriously at what I would call the sort of International Court of Anti-Corruption, so that the same principle applies under the International Criminal Court. If countries aren't prepared to clearly confront money laundering, purloining of major sums, if they domestically won't do it, there's a fallback to an international forum to do it. And our Refugee Council is partnering up with a group called the International Integrity Initiative, which Judge Mark Wolf in Boston is heading up, to say, let's start a movement around. It doesn't mean to say that we have to have 193 countries agreeing on it, but if we got 25 countries to start agreeing to themselves to have that kind of anti-corruption court, I think sooner, as we saw the landmines, it step by step begins to add to the numbers, and then it becomes a basic international norm and principle.
Okay, well, we'll stop there. And although I want a commitment from you that we can do this more often, because there's so much more to talk about.
Right.
I'll turn over to Karen Mock.
Thank you, Andrew. Lloyd, we can't thank you enough for taking time from your still very, very busy schedule to be with us today to talk about these very urgent issues. You truly are, for our next generations, a real mentor and a role model, showing them that you can go from becoming a young staffer to a cabinet minister to a university president, and not just any old guy, as you say, but to an elder statesman from whom we all continue to learn. And especially continue to learn in terms of the need for constant vigilance, political engagement, and to stand up for Canadian values and for what all Canadians should stand for. As we say in our Jewish tradition, may you go from strength to strength. I also want to thank all of the participants who tuned in and stayed with us. I'm watching the numbers, and they stayed with us right till the very end. Please join us on October 21st at 7 p.m. for another dynamic session, this time on the U.S. election, called Biden-Trump Uncovered. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask those who enjoy tuning in to also consider making a contribution to the Pearson Center so we can continue to bring you these very timely discussions on progressive policy issues. May everyone go from strength to strength and continue to be safe and be well.
Karen, as they say in my Christian tradition, amen.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thanks, Karen.